Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, first of all, let me just state something that's kind of unexpected at this time. I was with Wade Pascal, that's P-A-S-C-H-A-L, yesterday, and we're talking a little bit about love, which is something you don't see a lot and sense a lot of here in this body, about 1 Corinthians 13:13. The three things of faith, hope, and love, the greatest of this is love. And I find myself faced with that dichotomy sometimes and really feeling this and yet telling the truth at the same time, because sometimes the truth isn't that prevalent around here either. I had an unpleasant experience last Thursday with the junior senator from West Virginia, and it was pretty well assailed in different ways, and yet it really didn't bother me. Keith Oberman called me recently the worst person in the world, Vanity Fair, Dante's Inferno, conspiracy theorist, and when they're, I have to say this though, Madam President, at least they're all liberals, and liberals, I love them all. So having said that, let me discuss the politics of what's happening right now, because this is something that I think is going to end up being a very positive thing for Republicans. And I know not many people have thought this through in the same way that I'm going to present it. Now, tonight, the Senate will vote on whether to shut off debate on what well, first of all, it needs to be clarified. A lot of people don't really know what is going to happen tonight. I've been asked a lot of questions. Is it tonight at 5:30 or is it tomorrow? Well, the key vote is tonight. This is when they need 60 votes to cut off in order to get this to cut off a filibuster. They have to have in the United States Senate 2 Republicans. Now, if all Republicans stuck together in the Senate like they did in the House last week, this thing would be dead. It wouldn't go anywhere. And however, that's not what's going to happen. Martin Feldstein has called this an $800 billion mistake. He's not only one who's disappointed in the United States Senate. Democrats worked hard in the past week to make this nearly a $900 billion mistake. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office reported during the House consideration of its $820 billion version of this spending bill that the cost of servicing the debt on all new debt created by this bill would be roughly $347 billion over 10 years, which means at $820 billion, the real cost is, as you've heard before, many other people speaking, would be $1.2 trillion. It's a hard thing for people to grasp. It's hard for me. I remember when we were talking about the $700 billion bill that came up last October, the bailout, as it's been called, to try to put that in words so people understand it and so that I understand it. If you take the 140 million families that file a tax return and do your math, that's $5,000 a family. Now we're talking about something far greater than that. Now, I've been quoted as saying that this bill that we are going to be considering at 5:30 today is 93% spending and 7% stimulant. Now, we know what stimulant is. We know what it takes to stimulate the economy. But when I talked about what is in this bill that stimulates, I can only find 2 things. First of all, 2 very small tax provisions, one accelerating the depreciation, and the other a loss carryback provision. And then secondly, it has $27 billion in highway construction. This is interesting because the House bill actually had $30 billion. And my feeling was, if we're going to spend all this money, let's at least get something for it, provide some jobs, and get some roads and highways and bridges, things that this country really needs. But they elected not to do that. And so if you add together the accelerated depreciation and the tax benefits, that's about 3.5%, and the $27 billion is about 3.5% of the total amount that we're going to be talking about. So that's where you get 7% of stimulant for 93% spending. And we know we know what works. That's the thing that is frustrating to a lot of people. We know how to stimulate the economy. We've done it. At the end of World War I, they said, well, we raised taxes to support the war. Now we're going to reduce taxes because we don't need that money anymore. They reduced taxes. It increased the revenues. And I'll tell you, the real one that discovered this and who had the foresight was President Kennedy. President Kennedy, during the time that and the statement he made was, we've got to have more revenue to run this, all these Great Society programs. And the best way to increase revenue is to reduce marginal rates. So he lowered tax rates across the board, and that helped trigger the longest economic expansion in America's history. Now listen to this, Madam President. Between 1961 and 1968, the economy grew by 42%. 42%. Now fast forward to the 80s. In the 80s, we had a president named Ronald Reagan. In 1980, the total amount of revenue that was derived from the marginal rates was $244 billion. In 1990, it was $466 billion. It almost doubled in the decade that had the largest tax reductions in this nation's history. So we know what we can do. I have to say that a lot of this started with the $700 billion mistake that was made, in my opinion. That was back in October. The Senate voted 74-25 to empower one unelected bureaucrat to buy millions of dollars worth of troubled assets. As it turned out, interestingly enough, he didn't do that. That's what he said he was going to do. That's what he told me personally he was going to do. Finally, after all this bailout mania finally extended to the auto industry, Congress had the opportunity to redeem itself on the second half of the $700 billion mistake. In that vote, 33 Republicans and only 9 Democrats voted to disapproving the release of the second $350 billion. Now, you know, as if this is happened, we have to look what's been going on in the debate here. We're debating this multi-billion-dollar legislation. And I think some of my Republican colleagues are too gracious to lay collective blame where it should be, and that's clearly on the Democrat side. As the House considered this spending bill in a vote of 244 to 188, not a single Republican voted in favor of the $820 billion spending bill. Only by Republicans sticking together 100% together in the Senate could we stop this $1.2 trillion mistake. But should it pass this week, no one should be fooled to think that it was a bipartisan way. Now, at the end of the Senate's consideration of H.R. 1, we're voting tonight to end debate on what is going to be called a compromise proposal. It's being called a compromise proposal. Let me tell the American people that the vote tonight on a proposal supported by all the Democrats and 2 Republicans is the farthest thing from a compromise proposal. In fact, the proposal we're now considering really just makes this past week in the Senate a waste of all of our time. And why do I say that? Let's just look at the numbers. The House passed an $820 billion bill. Here in the Senate, we started with nearly $885 billion, more than the House. Although the compromise proposed reportedly only costs $780 billion, it includes the cost raising amendments in the Senate considered bringing the price tag to around $827. So what we're going to be considering tonight is actually $7 billion more than the House bill. Now, I do believe that Senator McCain made an excellent statement, and I'm going to read this statement because I think he captures it here. He says, this is on the floor of the Senate. He said, there are 178 members of the House of Representatives that are Republicans. They all voted against it, the bill, plus 11 Democrats. There are 40 Republican senators here. We now have 2, count them, 2, who have decided behind closed doors without consultation with the other 38 to come to an agreement, which you can call it a lot of things, but bipartisan isn't one of them, unless you say that two individuals and possibly a third, but no more than that out of 40 are in agreement. I've been involved in a lot of bipartisan legislation. Now, what we're talking about here is 2 out of 535 in the United States Congress, and both. This cannot be considered by anyone to be bipartisan. Now, I offered some amendments that I thought would be good, that would actually stimulate the economy. There are 2 of them. One was to redirect over $5 billion from programs such as television coupons, trail improvements, renovations of federal buildings in Washington, D.C., to military spending and procurement. According to the economic reports by Standard & Poor's, defense spending along with infrastructure investment and tax cuts has a greater stimulative effect on the economy than anything else in the government can do. However, how did my amendment fare? 37 Republicans and Senator Lieberman voted in favor of it. All the Democrats voted against it.
The senator has spoken for 10 minutes.
Yes, I ask unanimous consent to continue speaking for another 10 minutes.
Is there objection? The senator from Arizona.
Could the senator make that 5?
Yeah, 5's fine.
Thank you.
Without objection.
Well, anyway, that's part of it. The other is infrastructure, and to cut this short, the Department of Transportation has recently estimated that for every $1 billion invested in highways and bridges, 27,800 jobs are created. And the last jobless number shows that 899 construction workers have lost their jobs in the last 20. Now, if you do the math here, and you take both these amendments, had they passed, it would have provided over 4 million jobs. And this is the number that President Obama has talked about doing. Again, they should not have been defeated, but it was right down party lines. We have had several amendments. One of them was Senator McCain had probably the best one because it substituted with provision reducing payroll taxes, lowering marginal rates, lowering corporate rates, offering accelerated depreciation for small business. This is exactly what Kennedy and Reagan did back during that time. And on this one, all of the Republicans voted for it, all the Democrats voted against it. A bipartisan amendment was offered to allow repatriation of foreign earnings and tax rate. All of these amendments, and I will put the rest of them in as part of the record, these are all amendments that would have stimulated the economy. However, they're all killed right down party lines. Now, the reason I said at the very beginning of this, and I planned to get into a lot more detail, but I didn't know that we would be operating under the rules that we're operating under, is that this does, as I mentioned, have a happy ending. Katie, my daughter, put the thing up there, will you? Senator Kyle was talking about his 2 grandchildren. These are my 20 kids and grandchildren, so I equally have a great concern over what's happening. This little girl right here, Katie, my daughter, who has all these little girls, asked the question. She said, what does the United States do? If we did that, we would be bankrupt. And will our country go bankrupt? And I said, no. I want you to remember 1992. In 1992, a very similar thing happened. We had a Democrat in the White House. We had a Democrat-controlled House, a Democrat-controlled Senate, and we saw what happened. They started spending money. We had Hillary health care, all these things that the American people know won't work. And so I would just say this. I really believe that what is happening today, as bad as it sounds to conservatives right now, are things that can change this, things that would get the attention of the American people. And I really believe that we're going through the same thing we went in 1992, and we're going to have the same results 2 years from now that we had in 1994. This is the largest spending in the history of mankind, the largest spending in the history of the world. It's something we should not let happen, but it's going to happen right down party lines. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Well, Madam President,